yeah, we'll jump in. So
Mhm.
welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining this webinar. We're going to be talking about psychedelics and memory, covering a bunch of relevant topics around that. And we have us three. We're all PhD neuroscientists with a background in psychedelic neuroscience. And so to get us started, we're all just going to give some intros. I might as well go first because I'm already talking here. So my name is Manesh Girn. I am a postdoctoral researcher. I work at UCSF in San Francisco. I work with Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, who's a pretty well-known researcher in the field. And my background is in neuroimaging. So I do fMRI research, and I've done a couple of studies analyzing brain data with people under the influence of LSD, psilocybin, and DMT. And I've done a variety of projects there. And you might also recognize me from content I've created, a YouTube channel, Instagram page, The Psychedelic Scientist, where I create a lot of science education content around psychedelics as well. And I'm also chief research officer of a psychedelic bioscience company based in Canada called Entheotech Bioscience. And so deeply in the psychedelic field in various capacities, but yeah, training and background is as a neuroscientist. And maybe Manoj, you want to hop in?
Cool. Yeah, so I'm Manoj Doss. I'm a research fellow at Dell Medical Center at UT Austin. I just moved here from my postdoc at Johns Hopkins University. I work now with Greg Fonzo. And yeah, my background has been in neuroimaging as well, to some degree, as well as episodic memory. Studied the effects of various drugs, including psychedelics, on the impact on episodic memory, as well as other sorts of things, brain function, other aspects of cognition. And I also have some area of research that doesn't involve drugs and just looking at the effects of how, just looking at how memory can be distorted, essentially. I think that about sums up. Yeah.
Great.
Amazing. Yeah, thanks for that introduction. Hi, I'm Melanie Pincus. I am also a neuroscientist whose specialty has been in neuroimaging, specifically fMRI. And I studied early life trauma and stress and the ways it affects emotion circuits in the brain, setting up individuals for developing mood disorders during the adolescent transition. And when I finished up my time in academia, I went to Peru actually and had my first experiences with ayahuasca and became completely fascinated by psychedelics and wanted to really understand it from a neuroscience perspective, having been trained deeply in that field. So I threw myself into the literature and learned a ton. And then from there, got involved with some psychedelic startups in the last few years, creating research programs to study botanical mushrooms. And also with Manesh, have been creating educational content somewhat through Psychedelics Today. We have developed this 8-week course that we're going to be launching next week, the second cohort of, called Psychedelic Neuroscience Demystified, where we really get into the neuroscience of psychedelics, how they impact the brain, and how different facets of the subjective experience really lend themselves to the therapeutic mechanisms of these drugs. So we are really excited that you guys have joined us today for this talk, and super thank you to Manoj for being a guest on this webinar, because he's doing super interesting research on psychedelics and memory. So yeah, we can dive in.
Yeah, so this webinar will be an interactive discussion between us three, and I'll be sharing my screen with some slides just to guide us and provide some structure. So, as you know, the title of this webinar is The Neuroscience of Psychedelics, False Memories, and Memory Reconsolidation. And we've already gone through this. There's us three as the speakers. And this webinar is also partially in promotion for our course that Melanie just mentioned. It is a comprehensive psychedelic neuroscience course aimed at clinicians, therapists, and lay people, made it as accessible as possible, covering all the main things in psychedelic neuroscience, from the level of receptors to networks such as the default mode network and other networks, and also how psychedelics can inform clinical practice in different way. Psychedelic neuroscience can inform clinical practice. And the second cohort starts next week, so a week from today. So enough about that. So we're gonna frame this discussion by walking through 5 questions. And so I'm gonna outline them now, and then we're gonna walk through them discussing each. So the first question is gonna be, why should we care about how psychedelics alter memory processes? Why is this important? And I'm sure Manoj will have a lot to say there. And then question 2, how much can we trust our memories in general? Because there's a lot out there on the unreliability of memories, and we'll discuss a little bit about why that's the case based on how memory retrieval and other aspects of memory work in the brain. And then we'll just very general start with what kind of memory effects are commonly reported with psychedelics, both in the academic scientific literature and in clinical trials, but also just anecdotally. How do people talk about psychedelics and memory? And we'll just riff on that for a little while. And then we can talk about drawing on our discussion in question 3, how might psychedelics be enabling this? How might they potentially facilitate certain types of memory retrieval and facilitate the experience of having insights, whether they're accurate, true insights or not? Like, how would that process come about? And then this question might come up throughout, but like in case we don't fully cover it, question 5 is, how much can we really trust so-called recovered memories under psychedelics, as well as the insights facilitated by them? How much are these really reliable, and how much strength can we give them in general? And this is something Manoj had recently wrote about in a paper with a bunch of other collaborators. So lots of juicy stuff to discuss there for sure. So jumping in, maybe Manoj, if you want to just riff on this question a bit, why should we care about how psychedelics alter memory processes?
Yeah. So I mean, one is it keeps me working. But I think so. 2 is that, I mean, I think so. 1, when we talk about how they impact memory, I think all these things, there's many aspects to it. So I'm going to be using these terms a lot, so I might as well just define them now. So 1, we should be thinking about how they impair the formation or the encoding of memories. So, you know, when you're studying something, for example, you're encoding stuff, you're forming memories. But likewise, you know, when you're under the effects of psychedelics, you're not actually studying, but they can affect the way you take in information and what you subsequently remember, even when you're sober. So that's known as like the encoding phase of memory. You also have the consolidation or the stabilization phase. So this would be when essentially synapses, they have to stabilize that have been formed recently. And so, for example, when you take a psychedelic, what happened prior to you taking that psychedelic might be impacted in some way. And then lastly, you can impact the retrieval, which I think is, you know, kind of that last question you're getting at, this ability of, can a drug impact, you know, recovering something or retrieving something from before you're even on that drug, from yesterday or years ago or whatever. And so I think all of these questions, you know, 1, I think with the way we form memories under the effects of psychedelics, that can subsequently become a false memory, or it can even encode things in a way that can feel extremely true, which could be, you know, related to, you know, changing someone's behavior for better or worse. And then I think impacting the consolidation. I mean, 1 is, you know, what should we be having people do before they take the drug, right? Should we be showing them a bunch of like happy things, and then maybe it'll help them retrieve those things while they're under the effects of a psychedelic? Or might it even impair memory for those things, in which case you might not want to do something like that? And so this is talking about the consolidation, and then the retrieval, of course. And so, you know, as I'll get at, there's not really a lot of evidence for really any drug enhancing one's ability to retrieve memories from before they were on that drug. But if anything, a lot of drugs can tend to distort, you know, prior memories. And so I think all of these things can, you know, I think all these things apply to something like psychedelic therapy, or even just if, you know, when people are taking it in the woods or whatever. So yeah.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. And almost just to step back a little bit too, it's just like, you know, there's so much talk about how psychedelics alter memory in anecdotal reports, et cetera. And so when we're looking at the use of psychedelics in therapy and trying to uncover the mechanism, it's kind of like, it's an essential component of the mechanism, seems to be its effects on memory-related processes, which would encapsulate, you know, supposed memories of past repressed, lost experiences, kind of reconsolidating memories with less of an emotional charge. This comes up a lot in MDMA therapy. And then also understanding, I suppose, the reliability of all these things in general, right? And so in understanding the greater set of mechanisms which help us get better under psychedelics or which seem to produce therapeutic effects, memory is very a core part of that. And so along the lines of going under the hood, I think, in understanding the mechanisms, we could talk about mystical experiences, we can talk about these kind of cathartic emotional releases, let's say, but then it's like, okay, like what about a fundamental aspect of our cognition, memory? And it seems to be relatively understudied. Like there isn't that much work with psilocybin, for example, in memory. But
I know, I think I'm one of the few people that are currently doing that, at least explicitly, with like objective memory tests. So
yeah, which is kind of wild. But so yeah, it is something that's relatively understudied, but so central to the process. And we have so many assumptions and kind of this, like, there's a lot of myths around how psychedelics affect our memory, which haven't really been studied scientifically yet. And so a lot more research needs to be done.
And I think this is a general kind of, a flaw right now in psychedelic science, is that we aren't studying some of these aspects of cognition from a very kind of objective and from, a very kind of a deep point of view. Like all these fields, like episodic memory, for example, has been around for 100 years. The term episodic memory has actually only been around since like the 70s, but like the way people have been studying it has been around, objectively for a while. And so there's a lot, you can do now, like to understand that field as a whole PhD in itself without even applying drugs to it. And so I think it's, this is true of anything when you're talking about perception, working memory, attention, language, etc. And so I think we need more people who have like really good backgrounds in those things to be able to study them, because the few times we do see studies of like cognition with psychedelics, people are using some really old standardized tasks. All you'll end up seeing are impairments. And so it's not that interesting because you get that with drugs that tend to be less interesting, like alcohol, right? And then, I'll also see some things where I'm just like, oh my God, y'all should have got a cognitive psychologist on board. Like that is a terrible paradigm, a terrible task you used. And, I think people avoid doing that because it's, it does get really complicated quickly. And hopefully I can try to distill some of this, but yeah.
Totally.
Amazing. I also just wanted to zoom out another level too in answering this question of why we should care about how psychedelics alter memory processes, because a lot of these clinical populations are experiencing alternations in how they process memory. So the most obvious, of course, being post-traumatic stress disorder, where there's this repeated intrusive memories of a traumatic event that are disruptive to somebody's life. And there's this understanding or idea that what's happening is, as Manoj mentioned, there's the different phases of memory where there's first encoded, a memory is encoded, and then it's a bit malleable and it gets consolidated. And then a memory can be reactivated and then become malleable again and be reconsolidated. And so there's this idea that with PTSD, for example, the intrusive repeated memories are going into a labile state again and then being recalcified during the reconsolidation process and strengthening that loop of that intrusive memory. And so if psychedelics can very successfully intervene in that process and affect things in a different way, that's obviously a really important mechanism by which we can be helping clinical populations such as people with PTSD.
Yeah, and I think, it's worth mentioning that, when they're being reconsolidated, a lot of times there's distortions in these memories. And so people with PTSD, will sometimes not always have the most veridical trauma, like the trauma's almost spread to like other things such that it's beyond where it started. And so sometimes even if it's, distorting things back to more, being more veridical, that could be, for example, useful. But if you look at the animal literature, a lot of times it ends up just being trying to delete the memory. And I don't think that that's going to happen in the in humans anyways, or with psychedelics, but yeah.
Yeah, really interesting. And we'll come back to that later in the subsequent questions on why memory is so malleable like that. Like, why is it such that every time we retrieve it, it's going to be restored in a different way, right? Like, what does that say about retrieval process and how it's encoded in our brains and so on? Yeah. Anything else on this question here before we move on? I think we've made a solid case why this is interesting and important. Cool. The next question, we're kind of getting into this, like how much can we trust our memories in general, right? And like there's so many cases of unreliability of eyewitness testimony and just like really terrible stories where somebody is convinced that something happened when it didn't. You know, for example, convinced they perpetrated some kind of crime or some kind of heinous act, and there's like a collective delusion that can emerge when somebody believes something really strongly, even though it wasn't true, and it makes somebody else feel like, oh, that person believes it really strongly, it must be true. Then they believe it too, and then there's like this whole network effect of delusion, the delusive memories, right? And I think, and it's also the case that you ask 10 people, or not even like 3 people, their perspective on an event that they shared, everyone's going to have a different description. There's so many different acute factors related to your, you know, your emotional state, what you personally find to be personally relevant, and all sorts of things which bias your attention and therefore bias how you remember or recall things, right? So it's like, how can we trust any of our memories if it's so biased and relativistic and all these things, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, generally speaking, I think our memories are good, at least, the average, healthy person. But I think that there was some degree of like overestimating our memories with the idea of like the concept of like flashbulb memories, and that, like I will remember that forever exactly as it is. And I think the idea that, we have like a video in our head is certainly now been, more or less, not accepted. And I think the really famous kind of example, this was done in, I think it was done in the early 2000s, because this 9/11 happened in 2001. And so, yeah, people used essentially 9/11 as a kind of starting point for really making this kind of idea, this area of memory research, like the how veridical it is, how accurate it is, kind of making this as made it as a concrete point. And what they did was they followed people who, asking them where they were during 9/11. And then they followed people, for several years later, and then asked them again where they were and, what they were doing, et cetera. And what was interesting was that the reliability of people's memories went down, but their confidence either stayed the same or went up. And so it's like, and this seems kind of ridiculous, right? Like, because I remember thinking like, oh my God, like I was in, I think, 7th grade. And I think I was, in the car, and we were listening to the radio, but all the like radio stations stopped playing music and they were just reporting on this. And so and my mom was taking me to school. And what's really funny about this is I was telling my mom about my area of research, more of the false memory stuff. And she had the nerve to say, well, us Indians, we don't have, bad memories. And I was like, all right, Mom, where were we during 9/11? Because I bet we'll find some difference. And what really surprised me was how different our responses were. Because I just said I told her where I thought we were, which was in the car, going to school, and the radio stations have stopped playing music. I think 102.1 in Dallas, it was a rock station or something I was listening to. If I can, and that might be wrong. Maybe it's, that's already a detail that's inaccurate. Maybe it was 102.2. And then my mom was like, no, I was talking to your dad when this happened. And then, it was just like, well, how can we, determine who's right? And so we looked at the time of when 9/11 happened, and I can't remember if the first building or the second building, when it was hit, it was sometime around 9 o'clock. And then my mom was like, you would have already been in school. And I was like, shit, like, I guess I'm the one, who's wrong here. But then I remembered that in Texas, we're an hour behind. I went to school in Dallas. And I was like, wait a minute, I would have been in the car going to school at that time. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I'm sure there's some details that she's probably right about. Maybe she talked to my dad as soon as she dropped me off. But, it was just an example of, how our memories can differ. And in this case, it was a pretty drastic difference. So, yeah, I think that there's like, more, harmless, distortions in our memory, like remembering somebody with a different colored shirt or, a different name or whatever. But I think these things can get pretty distorted in certain cases, especially people who are emotionally vulnerable. And I mean, this was an example of, the satanic panic, right? Where people are literally, saying that, oh, my parents sacrificed like a bunch of newborn babies. And, if that were actually happening, I mean, somebody has to get pregnant and carry a baby for 9 months. There's only so many babies that can be sacrificed before somebody's going to find out. So, that was, like an example of how bad, things can get with, your memory, essentially.
Totally.
I guess I would follow up and just ask to Manoj, since you write about the memory wars a bit in your papers, this question around trusting our memories, but like this specific issue of repressed memories where the entirety of the narrative memory is lost and then spontaneously recovered. Yeah, what you could say about what the scientific consensus these days is on that, and like some of the research that supports that consensus.
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I mean, I should probably clarify here that there's multiple memory systems. And so the one that I really study is episodic memory, which is thought to require like the hippocampus. It's remembering that, I did this thing yesterday at this time, for example. It's where, when type information, details, etc., explicit details. There's also semantic memory, which kind of is something that I'm a little bit, I like hop into a little bit, which is more kind of memory for facts, knowledge, etc., meaning. So you might not have the episodic memory anymore for where you learned that the first president of the country is George Washington, but you certainly have the semantic memory that George Washington is the first president of the country. And so Zendel Tolving, who he just passed away actually, I think a few weeks ago, who came up with this distinction, and this was in the 70s. And it's kind of like, well, are these things really separable? But I think now you can kind of show this. So if you take a patient that doesn't have their hippocampus, they have their hippocampus removed, they're still going to have all the facts that they've learned that have become consolidated. Let's say in this case, systems consolidation. So they've sort of transferred their reliance from the hippocampus to more of the cortex. And they're not really episodic anymore. So it's not like it's a qualitative shift in the way the memory is represented. And I think the truth is probably that memories are kind of on the spectrum of being more semantic-like to more episodic-like. And so there's also other aspects of memory, like there's other types of memory like fear conditioning. So there's some really there's a famous story of this neurologist, I think, who was working with a patient that had amnesia. I think they probably had damage to their hippocampus. And so, they would meet you and then turn away, the attention gets shifted, they come back to you, they meet you again. Like, oh, hey, what's up, And so what the neurologist did, you'd never be able to get away with this, by the way, anymore, but this was, ages ago, was that I think he shook the hand of this patient with a tack in his hand. Right. And so pricked the person essentially. And then the person ended up like, being like, ow. And then, the next time they meet, the neurologist sticks out his hand again. And then the patient doesn't know why, but it's just like, nah, like your hand is dirty or something. I'm not going to mess with that. It doesn't have the episodic memory, but kind of still has this strange feeling, this conditioned response, a fear response in some way to being like, no, I'm not doing that. And so, this is another type of memory that, tends to, not necessarily involve the hippocampus, or it doesn't have to. It's probably more amygdala dependent. And of course, all of these memory systems can interact. You also have memories, for example, like riding a bike. If I take out your hippocampus, you'll still know how to ride a bike. And there's actually like a case of where you can teach people to like write in a mirror. It's called like mirror drawing or something. And so you have people learn. It's not an easy thing to do if you're looking at a mirror and not your hand and having to like write that way. And, they'll train a patient that doesn't have episodic memory, that doesn't have a hippocampus, and they can learn how to do that. But my guess is, maybe by like the 5th time when they get pretty good at it, they're like, dang, I'm like a natural at this. And it's like, no, you just did this 5 times and just don't remember it. So there's multiple different types of memories. And so this is all to say that I think that when it comes to something like recovering a traumatic repressed memory, I don't think that those are generally veridical. There could be some underlying like conditioned memory that is, somehow resulting in this fear response. But I think that those can now, it can then create, let's say, a false memory. They can feed into something that can result in a distorted episodic memory. So, I mean, just to, give you, an example, if you had some type of abuse, let's say as a 2-year-old, you're not going to remember that episodically later on down the line. People just don't have memories from when they were 2. But my guess is that that's going to mess you up in some way that's still going to be encoded somewhere in the circuit, such that maybe now you just have a general, you just have generalized anxiety now or something along those lines. But the idea of actually like recovering, I mean, the problem in PTSD is not that they can't recover a memory, it's that they can't forget it. So yeah, and I know that this is, you know, like it can be a little bit controversial to say that, but at least in the memory world, there's really no evidence, and most of us don't really buy the idea of repressed memories. And the satanic panic was a really good example of how distorted these things can get. And I know that, you know, and I also just do want to be sensitive, because like sometimes it doesn't matter whether or not the memory is real, you know. If no one's being like accused of something, then it doesn't matter at the end of the day. Or there's also cases where people just don't want to say, you know, what the issue is, and then it looks like a recovered memory. And it is true, but it wasn't recovered. It was just that they didn't want to have to talk about it until they were ready. So, you know, I think that, yeah, I mean, the Freudian notion of like a repressed memory, I'm like very against. And I think that this is something that we're probably going to have to worry about with, you know, with psychedelic therapy and, you know, certain therapists that buy into that kind of stuff. And I hope we don't run into another satanic panic, but I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, here's like, yeah, thank you for that. It definitely makes a lot of sense. And I'm thinking, you know, the concept of repressed memories could just be in like the concept that psychedelics will induce the recovery of repressed memory could just be an instance of a kind of like memory priming, like episodic priming, where now, given the nature of the experience and let's say you're exploring different, I don't know, different areas of your memory space, through in your experience, now you're able to access these neighborhoods in your memory where you're more proximal to a memory you had long forgotten. And so then therefore you're primed to remember this like distant memory that you wouldn't have usually accessed because your mind is operating in a different space. So in that case, it's not necessarily retrieving a repressed memory, it's just contextually priming you for these memories you don't usually access.
Yeah.
I feel like
I
that
mean,
makes more sense.
yeah, like, I mean, you know, an example that I can give is that since moving back to Austin, there's people I've thought about that I haven't thought about in ages. I used to live here. I did my undergrad here, and then now I've moved back, and now it's like, oh, it's brought up various people. But those people, if somebody had asked me like, oh, who's so-and-so, I would have been like, oh, wait, I probably went to high school with them or something like that. It's not that I'd like completely forgotten them. And so I think that there's certainly that, yeah, when you're in a different, you know, state, or you have a different sets of cues in your environment that can, you know, bring up certain things you just haven't thought about in a while. I think that's one thing. But, you know, the idea of like, hey, have, you know, like, you know, taking this to an extreme case, like, have you ever been like physically abused? And then you're completely, you know, you don't remember anything. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait, no, my, you know, parents used to, you know, whatever, do so-and-so, do whatever it might be. It's like, that is a very different case where you've had those opportunities to bring it up. And yet it didn't come up. And then all of a sudden now you have this extremely vivid, detailed memory. That is a situation where, unless, like I said, you were maybe wanting to like, you weren't ready to talk about it, that's one thing. I would probably be on the side of, well, I'm not sure I can totally buy that. Yeah.
Can I push back a little bit
Sure.
and ask a few more questions around this? Okay, so yeah, with what Manesh was saying, I agree that it seems like very difficult to tease apart a forgotten memory, like a long ago forgotten memory that's coming back up versus the idea of a repressed memory that's totally outside of conscious awareness. And like in my experience, for example, there have been times where someone does bring up a memory like, oh, remember that time we went to that amusement park and like such and such a thing happened? And I'm like, no, I don't remember that. And they'll like even give me more details. And I'm like, no, I don't remember that. And so even though it actually happened. And so I think that like the confusion for me when I think through this is that like the veracity part of whether the memory happened or not seems like you could only really substantiate that through corroborating evidence from other people who are present. And that just seems difficult to collect that data. And so on the one hand, I totally understand the bulk of data showing that we are highly susceptible to memories being implanted and distorting our memories. And at the same time, it seems that without that proof of like corroborating evidence, and like it also feels hard to disclaim the possibility that like maybe there are forgotten memories or repressed memories that truly happen, but there isn't corroborating evidence for them.
Yeah, so I think the forgetting is actually a lot more common than we probably think. It's probably less common. I mean, it's certainly less common with very emotional situations unless you dissociate. But I mean, usually when people like really dissociate and they lose touch with what's going on, they're not encoding new things. But yeah, I think the forgetting, I mean, certainly that I think that all of us have had that experience where it's like, oh, do you remember this? And it's like people provide evidence showing like, look, you gave me this thing. And I'm like, oh, that's where I lost that thing. Like, and you don't even, yeah, it's like you have no memory of it, but clearly this person, must be saying something that's true, given that they have something that, you owned. And so, I mean, I think that can definitely happen. And I think, again, it can even happen with, certain emotional cases. I'm having a concussion, for example. But being able to recover now those memories is where I think that's where things get very, very unlikely. And so like I had a concussion when I was 18. And I mean, in this case, there's a very, a strong neurological, insult that's happening. And I mean, I never got back those memories. I was awake the whole time. And yet like, I don't remember getting the ambulance. I don't remember, apparently they asked me, if I have a brother or sister. So here's where my semantic memory was kind of messed up too. They asked me if I have a brother or sister. I said I have a brother. When I don't, I have a sister. But then they asked me who the president of the country was. And keep in mind, this is in 2006. And apparently I said fucking Bush. So I still, there were very salient things I think were still quite, there for me. And so, but yeah, I'm never going to get those memories back. And in many ways, I probably don't want to. I broke some teeth. I needed stitches, and I was in a bad place clearly. And so, yeah, I think it's the recovering part when you usually, like I said, the issue is forgetting these things and not being able to forget and move past them and move them from, let's say, being episodic to just like a fact that happened to you. Not so much that it's like, oh yeah, now I can like retrieve this thing and remember the whole episode and all the details. That is where I think, things start to get a little like mashed up. And, other influences, like, for example, a therapist that keeps trying to probe at something and you're like, no. And all of a sudden you start mixing up events of like, let's say, you got beaten up by like some school kids, and then you mix that up with like a time where your parents got mad at you. And next thing you know, you're like, oh yeah, my parents used to beat me when I was a kid. I mean, that's like, I think situations that are probably more common than the situation of like, oh yeah, I suddenly remember this thing that's actually true, even though it was a very emotional event. And, I haven't been able to access it up until now that I've taken psychedelics or, been with the right Freudian therapist or whatever.
So, okay, I want to move on.
We should move on as well.
Okay, I'll pin my question.
Okay. We should, yeah. So yeah, switching more into specifically psychedelics. Well, we've kind of already answered this question a bit, right? Like commonly people report, vivid relivings of past experiences, of memories that they, had previously forgotten or feel like they had repressed. And I mean, we can also get into associative memory where they feel like they perceive new connections between experiences or concepts as well. And
so, yeah, I guess, well, one thing I was going to say is this meant to be more of the common, like what people report, which we've kind of gone over, or is this like, for example, what I've found in the lab?
Right. Well, a bit of both. So we've gone over what common reported. So how about, let's talk a bit about the actual findings.
Yeah, so this is what I like about what I do is that, especially when you're studying kind of these like really fine-grained aspects of cognition, you can't generally, just based on your own psychedelic experience, be able to like predict what can happen. And that's what, I think that sometimes, studying phenomenology, I think it's definitely necessary, but a lot of times, at the end of the day, I'm just like, duh, like psychedelics produce mystical experiences. Wow, But like when I tell you, for example, what I think psychedelics are doing to the encoding of memories, I don't think this is exactly something you could have predicted, or even what's happening during memory retrieval or consolidation. And so what I've, the thing I've been working on a lot recently, and so actually the paper was just accepted. There's a preprint online, but you should just wait for the big paper to come out because there's a big model that comes after it. And because of some other reviews, the paper is currently in the preprint form, just very scattered. Like the reviews from the previous journal actually made it worse. And then it just got accepted into psychological review, where the reviewers were definitely hard on me, but like they made the paper so much better. And I mean, I would buy them drinks if I knew who they were. And so one of the things we ended up showing was that, so just to give you all more, terms here. So there's kind of two processes we can think about when we're retrieving memories. And I mean, there's more, of course, but at least two big ones that we like to think about. One is recollection. So this is kind of your more standard way of thinking of episodic memory, retrieving hippocampal dependent retrieval of details, associations, like what you were thinking at that time when something happened, where, when information, etc. But then the less intuitive kind of form, like the less intuitive process that might happen during memory retrieval, and these two things are probably in most cases co-occurring, is familiarity. And familiarity is this weird thing that kind of sits between semantic memory and episodic memory in some way. It's this sense of knowing without really having any kind of corroborating evidence. So, for example, I might, meet some of you one day. Well, I hope that I'll recognize you all in public now and outside of this kind of context. But, let's just pretend I might see Melanie one day at a conference and then be like, I know I've met you before, but I can't remember where I met you, when I met you, what your name is, et cetera. It's just, you feel highly familiar despite the fact that I can't recollect, any details. I think another, that's kind of the most common example is, with faces. And I think that's one that happens a lot. There's also what's known as the butcher on the bus phenomenon. When back in the day when people had butchers, now it'd probably make more sense to call it the barista on the bus phenomenon, but where you can see somebody who you recognize, you can't remember where you met them, when you met them, turns out they're your barista. And outside of that context, it's hard to recognize them. But another example that I've kind of found myself in is watching a movie that I've seen before. Like maybe I watched it late night, and maybe even like, I was like barely paying attention or was sleepy. And then I'll watch that movie again. And let's say it's a, M. Night Shyamalan movie. The M, by the way, stands for Manoj.
Really?
I don't know if anybody knew that. Yeah, little fact. I guess he didn't like his name. But anyway, in that kind of a movie, it's like, okay, there's a twist at the end, right? And then so whenever, it turns out, Bruce Willis is the dead guy. Sorry, spoiler for anybody. That might be, a situation where everybody else is shocked in the room, but I'm like, wait a minute, I've seen this before and it doesn't shock me. That's a sense of, even though I couldn't say, oh, that was the final twist. It doesn't surprise me because I had seen it before, and the familiarity of it removed that kind of shock factor. And so this whole thing of, recollection, familiarity, there's another aspect, another kind of component to this is the conscious experience of it. And so Endel Tolving, this guy from 1970, when he came up with this, 1972, I think. So the idea of like recollection, he referred to the conscious experience as being autonoetic consciousness. It involves placing the self back in time. And so, this is why it was autonoetic. Whereas semantic memory and familiarity as well involves just noetic consciousness, just kind of a sense of knowing. And keep in mind, this is independent of the psychedelic community that is now referred to that undeniable sense of knowledge that people have, they feel like they have when they're under the effects of psychedelics, as the noetic quality. And so what's really cool is my two areas of research have like kind of converged on this like noeticism. And by the way, I think it all goes back to William James. So William James is actually somebody that all times memory researchers will like have their students read William James, because he's talked a lot about memory. He was kind of like, your original like psychologist in many ways, and in cognitive psychologist without doing a lot of the experiments. And then it also turns out he did a lot of nitrous oxide and had this noetic quality. So I think actually that like noetic term was something Tolving probably took from William James, and that's also where I think it came into the psychedelic world. So one of the things we end up showing, at least now to bring you to what we're finding in the lab with psychedelics, so at least during memory encoding. So I'm going to show you a bunch of stimuli, like let's say a bunch of pictures, and then while you're on psychedelics or placebo, and then I'll test your memory, let's say a day later when you're sober. And so the formation of memories that you end up having involve less recollection. And in fact, recollection's impaired, and we can show that through different types of tasks. We can show that with computational models, etc. Things that you might see in like a person with hippocampal damage, although maybe not to that degree. However, those memories that are formed based on familiarity, those seem to be enhanced. And so, it's like there's a high sense of knowing, and yet, people can't recollect specific details. And if not enhanced, at least they're spared. Whereas all other drugs like alcohol, ketamine, dextromethorphan, THC, benzodiazepines, Ambien, they all they impair the formation of memories based on recollection and familiarity. At least when you crank up the dose, familiarity gets impaired as well. And so what's really odd here is as we cranked up the dose to 30 milligrams of psilocybin when people are barely functional, we actually start to see that familiarity gets more enhanced. And so in some ways, I kind of replicated this recently in collaboration with Maastricht University in a study using psilocybin and 2CB, but we find something odd, that familiarity is this ambiguous signal that can be misattributed to other things. So you can misattribute feelings of familiarity resulting in false memories. Like if I'm giving you a false memory task and I somehow ramp up the familiarity for things that aren't quite what you saw but are related, and now you might falsely say you saw something that you didn't actually see. You can also do the same types of manipulations that ramp up familiarity, and it can lead to people feeling like they're having an insight on like an insight learning task. It can also result in like high amounts of familiarity can be misattributed, and usually things that are familiar are processed more easily by the brain. The brain, let's say, generally likes things that are easily processed, less resources, and this can result in things like liking something more. So this is known as the mere exposure effect. If I show you a face twice, you're more likely to rate it as likable, attractive, et cetera, than if I only showed it to you once. Or there's the illusory truth effect. If I show you, and by the way, recollection can stop that from happening. I can say, wait a minute, I remember I met you before, and then that's going to stop me from being like, oh, I don't just like you more now, Or alternatively, I think this is maybe a better example, is the illusory truth effect, where I show you statements twice. And those statements that you've seen more than once, you're going to be more likely to rate them as true. This is probably how certain politicians, right, get elected. They keep saying something over and over again, and it becomes more likable, or it seems more true, like so-and-so's emails. And so even though there's no new data coming in, it's like, oh, this must be true about their emails. And so, this ends up being kind of, but however, I can say, oh man, why does this thing seem so true? And it's like, oh, that's right, I saw it on CNN earlier. So if I can use recollection, I can a lot of times control things like the illusory truth effect or the mere exposure effect. I control those misattributions of familiarity or fluency. And so if you don't have that recollection, they can become misattributed. And actually in this new study, we sort of show that essentially, where we get some misattributions of familiarity resulting in actually people saying they saw things they didn't really see, but not quite in the way that it's like a false recollection. And so, so it's not like a full blown like false memory, although these things can, this was actually like one of the first studies I did without drugs in my PhD, was showing that ramping up fluency or familiarity can eventually result in things like false recollections.
Okay.
So that's at least one aspect. That's one thing I'll say that's unique about psychedelics. There's other, the how psychedelics impact consolidation and retrieval are also quite interesting, but maybe I'll
think
say that for a second. Yeah.
That's great.
I think,
yeah, Melanie.
Yeah, just like in the interest of time, what I really want to hear you talk about too is the ways you think then that applies to someone's psychedelic experience, where they're having visions come up in their mind's eye, and then perhaps believing them to be true. Like, what is happening there in relationship to what you're unpacking with these memory encoding and retrieval effects?
Yeah, so I think that, for example, people come out of like mystical experiences, let's say, and they have this like heightened sense of noeticism, and yet the details are relatively scarce. I mean, they might put little things like, oh, I saw this little demon or whatever, but a lot of times those actual details aren't always there. And I think they've also got multiple kind of rampant thoughts that are going on at the same time. And I think people, for example, the illusory truth effect, I think is something that happens under the effects of psychedelics, that you're enhancing the fluency with which certain thoughts come up, and then you think they're true, or you think you get an understanding of, let's say, the universe or consciousness, and yet you're not coming back winning any Nobel Prizes. So I think that there is or in the sense of the mere exposure effect, something a little bit more harmless, two people will trip on the couch, not even talk to each other as they lay under blankets, and they become best friends later. So I think that there is this misattribution of heightened fluency that I think does happen under the effects of psychedelics. And this, by the way, leads to this model that I've been working on that I call flux for fluency exaggeration. But, that's, y'all will have to see the paper whenever I finish writing it. but yeah, I mean, I think so. Here's the thing. I think that, something about how this can, actually affect, let's say, something like psychedelic therapy, a heightened sense of noeticism, comes from familiarity and, let's say, semantic memory. And so I think one thing that could be happening, so just to get more back to some of these like nitty gritty details in neuroscience. So there's this idea that the hippocampus, it trains the cortex, and that's where your semantic memories are, the cortex, and then your hippocampus is required for episodic memory. So the hippocampus is, this region in the middle of the brain that's kind of binding a bunch of disparate elements, like all your senses, into single episodes. And then over time, across those episodes, statistical regularities are being pulled, and those are what eventually become instantiated as semantic memories in your cortex. So, for example, like the first several times you ate a pizza, right? You didn't know what this pizza was. It's this new experience. And then, over time, you're kind of forgetting the details and the episodes of the first time you ate pizza, but now you know what a pizza is. It's been instantiated in a way that'd be really difficult to forget what a pizza is. There's probably not a single area you could damage that would remove, your pizza concept. The anterior temporal lobe would be the way to try to do that. But really, it's become distributed in such a fashion that, like, you now know what it smells like, tastes like, et cetera. And it's quite robust to injury. So I think that, I think one thing psychedelics could be doing is kind of fast tracking. It's kind of bypassing the hippocampus and being like a fast track to learning in the cortex. And I think the other thing I should mention is the hippocampus can also constrain, I think, the way things are learned. Your recollection can constrain, as I said, what you attribute your familiarity to, what you attribute that noeticism to. And in other ways, you can think of this is, like just semantic activation or priming. If I'm, I've used this example before. If I'm staring at the sky and somebody gives me the word blue, it's now going to activate things like, I'm going to spread through semantic space, thinking of birds, clouds, sky, etc. If I'm leaving a psychiatric ward and you give me the word blue, now I'm going to get mood, sad, happy. Those are going to be things that activate. So your recollection can constrain the way things activate through the cortex, and then subsequently what's learned in the cortex. There's also what's known as the memory blocking effect, where if I give you like a similar word and that's stuck in recollection, you can't come up with the word that I'm trying to get you to come up with. So if I can't even think of an example right now, but, two similar words, right? And so, if you remove the hippocampus's, input, the context with which it's providing the cortex, this might allow for more kind of free flow through the cortex, and then subsequent learning that could, for example, disrupt maladaptive, semantic memories. So essentially beliefs, I think, they are basically semantic memories that not everybody in the world shares. I believe I was born in Texas. I don't have the, episodic memory for that. I can't remember my birth certificate. I just know I've been told this my whole life, and not everybody has that information, but I do. Or like a belief in God, or a belief in, whatever, or even just that I believe I'm a terrible person, right? Like something like that. After several years of depression, that's now become like truth to me, a belief, a semantic memory, essentially. It has a sense of noeticism to it. Disrupting something like that can be quite difficult. And perhaps with something like psychedelics, we can now alter this learning in a way that it's no longer being biased by whatever the hippocampus is filled with. Like if I every day only focus on the bad things, well, and how bad of a person I am, I keep thinking of that. Not only is that in my cortex, that's also my hippocampus, and it's going to constrain what my cortex is going to learn. Now you change the input to the hippocampus by essentially cutting it off with psychedelics to some degree. And then you can now allow for more free flowing through the cortex that can allow for different types of learning. And this all, also I should mention that everybody talks about the serotonin 2A receptors in the cortex. They're on excitatory pyramidal neurons. But at least in the hippocampus, as well as the input to the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex, they're pretty much like almost exclusively on inhibitory interneurons. So it does make sense that you get this impairment of recollection, perhaps an enhancement of familiarity, even though it might be kind of a exaggerated sense of familiarity that can become misattributed. And so I think this could be used for both good and bad things, right? People can have some, bizarre ideas and decide to go chase them because the, noetic quality behind it seems so true. But in other situations, it could be, hey, like, maybe I'm not a bad person, right? And if that becomes now instantiated, you can't have two facts that are completely, against each other. I'm a bad person and I'm a, good person. And so, I think eventually you can disrupt some of these kind of more maladaptive ones. I mean, I don't know how to do that in an adaptive way, and I think there's situations, for example, where we do get writing to the cortex that we don't want from psychedelics. Like, I think HPPD is probably a situation where you're probably doing something weird to like visual cortical areas. And now, even after people stop tripping, they still have these distortions in them. So yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the long answer, I guess.
Cool. Can I give a little summary for our viewers here based on some main points? I think the core thing you're saying here is that, psychedelics enhance familiarity and things like fluency and impair recollection. So we might have a sense that something seems very true, seems very familiar, but just because you no longer have the context for which that might have happened, and so it's kind of this free floating inside our memory that has this strength to it, and so therefore.
And it can be misattributed. Yeah, right. and it can be misattributed. And it's worth saying again that this is all the encoding effects. This is like what you're forming. And this is why I think, a lot of times what, people want to know is, well, how does it affect retrieval? Because then we can alter the way that like memories from the past are impacting this person. But I also think we should be focusing on what we're encoding. And this is why, I've been a little bit of like, I call it the couch method, where people just throw people on a couch and with eye shades on a high dose of, psychedelics. And it's like, oh, that's the only way to do psychedelic therapy, when maybe there's things some type of input we should be giving people that can alter, what was subsequently encoded, to really get those things to kind of get, kind of crystallized in the cortex. But, this is now where it's getting to be a little speculative.
Right.
But I should say the consolidation effects are also interesting, that a lot of these effects might actually be consolidation. Given that the drug effects, when you encode something under the effects of a drug, they persist beyond encoding. And so with some drugs, you can differentiate these two, like with alcohol. If I give you alcohol before I show you a bunch of stimuli, you're not going to remember anything the next day for your test. However, if I make you show you a bunch of stimuli and then give you alcohol immediately afterwards, when these memories have to stabilize, that you'll actually enhance your memory. And so this is like one of the most bizarre, coolest effects I've seen in psychopharmacology, called retrograde facilitation. And so in that situation, that when I gave you alcohol prior to showing you stimuli before encoding, that it's not due to consolidation, because if you actually give the drug immediately post-encoding, during consolidation, that you get the complete opposite effect. It turns out there's one study in humans and one study in rodents showing that if you administer a psychedelic immediately after encoding of like episodic like memories, that you can get an enhancement of, in the case of in humans, it was kind of a familiarity type. They didn't really properly estimate familiarity, but it's kind of a familiarity like memory. And in animals, it's actually the analog to, familiarity in animals. It involves the same regions. It's not necessarily hippocampal dependent. And so some of these effects I'm seeing in theory could be due to familiarity, or maybe you get enhanced with familiarity from encoding or consolidation. And then the last thing I do want to say is memory retrieval, where it hasn't been properly tested. But given that I've sort of shown it with MDMA, it shows up with all kinds of other drugs. So THC, stimulants, as well as to sometimes with sedatives, GABA A sedatives like benzodiazepines and alcohol. But you generally just get an increase in false memories, that people will say they saw a bunch of things they didn't actually see. And it can even be pretty like bizarre things like gruesome photos. So yeah, that's kind of the three ways in which I've been studying, the phases of memory, as well as all the different memory processes associated with those things. So as I was trying to get at the very beginning, it can get very complicated quickly. But, we're starting to do this now with psychedelics.
Cool. Thanks so much for that, Manoj. Just we're at time, because this is an hour webinar. We could go on for another hour easily, but I think there was one question in the Q&A, and maybe I'll give you a pinch to you as the memory researcher, so I'll just read it to you. Any comments on state-specific memory and the sense of familiarity under a psychedelic, such as, oh, I'm here again, like recognizing experience, which sometimes even occurs the first time somebody takes it. I guess that's the noetic quality, but I'll let you speak to that. And then 2, reminders of insights we already knew, but don't think about in regular life.
Yeah, so state-dependent like learning is, really interesting. And so you can do this especially with like context, forget even drugs, right? There were studies that went down in like the 70s. I think it was just an excuse for a bunch of memory researchers to go get funding to go scuba diving in the south of France. But what they did was they had people like study words either on land or underwater. And then they tested their memories either on land or underwater. And your memory's better whenever you're, in the same context that you studied in. And so, that's something that I think is, pretty real. We can do that with just computer screens, and have, a background context like a beach, show you stimuli on the beach. And then when I test your memory, I either change that context to like the forest, or I keep it as the beach. And your memory would be better if I kept it on the beach. So there's things like that that certainly are real. But when it comes to some of these drug effects, they worked really well in the 70s. And I feel like more recently, they don't work as well anymore. So there's a study that was done at my old lab at University of Chicago where I did my PhD, and they try to do it with amphetamine during encoding. And then 2 days later you come in and they give you amphetamine during retrieval. And there wasn't really any benefit to it. And so that was one situation. I think there's been some recent studies with alcohol and it doesn't work. Maybe to some degree it probably does work. It seems to be more hippocampal dependent, the type of memory that you can kind of re-queue up. And so it'd be more like recollection, but even then it doesn't, I actually reanalyzed those amphetamine data in this thing that I got accepted into psychological review. And again, we didn't really see any evidence for when I try to dissociate recollection from familiarity. There still really wasn't much evidence for this, enhancement when you had amphetamine during encoding and retrieval. But I think it'd be really cool to try with psychedelics. It's worth a shot. And it certainly, at least for something like therapy, provides some continuity, and maybe it could help queue up certain memories. But what were the other parts of that question? All
right, can you talk about like why people might feel familiar the first time they do a psychedelic, I suppose. Yeah. And then also how psychedelics can remind us of insights we already knew.
Yeah, so I think that when it comes to that, I think it's a misattribution of familiarity. So I think there's two sides to this. One is that this is one of the most bizarre things, right, with psychedelics, and kind of like one of the areas I'm studying that I think is like finding a hole in like psychedelic research, something that's kind of obvious, but and very paradoxical. And yet, people aren't really studying this, is there's novelty and familiarity that can be experienced on psychedelics that are heightened. And like, that's extremely paradoxical, that I can feel like everything, I'm seeing it as a child again. And, I'm looking at very mundane things and just like, wow, or like I'm having, what's known as like jamais vu. So jamais vu is essentially, so déjà vu is basically familiarity, no recollection. Jamais vu is no familiarity, but you have the recollection. And so I can come up with a word and I'm like, wait, is serendipity really a word? And it feels kind of foreign, right? So people will kind of have that experience. People have that experience even sober. If you repeat a word several times over, that's how they do it in the lab. They'll have people write words down like 100 times, and then people will report that it starts to get a little weird. There might be something about too much fluency results in less familiarity. And there's actually a weird U-shaped curve you can get from certain brain regions that might reflect that. But in any case, I think that that's one aspect of the psychedelic experience, this heightened sense of novelty for things that aren't necessarily novel. But then there's also heightened sense of familiarity for things that probably aren't actually familiar as well. And so I think one aspect of this is that things can get processed. Let's say I'm looking at this bottle and then I get this heightened sense of fluency. I can now misattribute the sense of noeticism to something else. And now this other bottle over here might feel familiar, or this other face, this other person, this other concept, whatever. And so I think that there's essentially a misattribution of heightened noeticism due to fluent processing. And so what I should say is heightened novelty. What comes with heightened novelty is greater processing in the brain. You actually get a lot of greater brain activity in like regions and visual, in like in cortical regions, essentially. And then what comes with heightened processing is actually more fluent processing, greater sense of familiarity, fluency, which is actually associated with less brain activity. So I think that, what comes up basically must come down. And then where you end up interpreting that is probably also getting messed up somehow, sometimes by psychedelics. And again, I think this could be useful. Misattributing a sense of fluency to something like, like a relationship might be a good thing. Like, oh, hey, maybe it's actually a good thing. But it can, I think, get, a little distorted when people start to have these bizarre ideas and think they're true. That, I think, is where we get a little, and that's, I think, what that, false insight paper that I wrote with Hugh McGovern and Ruben Lakonin is kind of about. And so, as far as insights that we knew, I think there's a really cool Anne Shulgin quote about this, that she says something along the lines of like, it's not that you have some crazy insight, right? It's just that there's kind of these little truths that we knew, and we just sort of, kind of stopped paying attention to them for a while. And now they kind of, come back up. I think that's essentially that jamais vu, where it's like you realize again, oh wait, this is actually like, very useful. It's novel. It feels, there's a heightened sense of processing that comes out of it. And again, I think that can be useful at times. There's probably other situations. I mean, I think it's usually good to like reflect on things. But there might be some really mundane ideas that all of a sudden you think is new, is very novel. And, if you now think that that's the case, that, could actually result in something not very useful. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Amazing.
Awesome.
Thank you for such a thorough answer. I want to pop in and say that, yeah, it's a few minutes after the hour. So for those folks who want to take off, we just wanted to let you know that there's a discount code that I'll put in the chat for anyone who wants to sign up for our 8-week Psychedelic Neuroscience Demystified course that's starting next week on Wednesday. And yeah, Manoj, there's some other questions that came in on the Q&A and the chat. So I don't know if you have some more time right now, if you want to stick around for a few more questions.
15 minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
If anybody did want to ask anything or
So yeah, let's blaze through these questions. And there's a couple in the chat, and then there's one in the Q&A.
Okay.
So I don't know if you want to, maybe I'll read it out loud.
Yeah,
sure,
please.
Yeah, sounds great.
So one from Romy is, is there any research examining the impacts of psychedelics on long-term memory too? No. Yeah.
So
not sure how you want to interpret that.
long-term memory, that's the thing, right? Is that it can mean a lot of things. And so I've stopped using things like long-term and short-term memory. I've stopped using those terms. Long-term memory can mean episodic memory. It can mean semantic memory. It can even mean like riding a bike type memory, right? That's a long-term memory that I'm unlikely to forget until, I get Parkinson's or something like that. Actually, oddly enough, there's really interesting videos where you can see that Parkinson's patients can't walk, but they can sometimes ride a bike. But yeah, so yeah, it's so I mean, long-term memory, I mean, it is a lot of what I'm studying, really. Episodic memory is a form of long-term memory. And I think when things become more permanent, a lot of times those are semantic memories, and maybe that's more of the long-term memory that you're talking about. And so, yeah, I mean, I think to some degree, I think psychedelics are kind of, potentially fast-tracking some of these things that can become essentially semanticized and have this noetic quality to it without necessarily having the details of how you got there. I think insights can a lot of times be that way. And there's really interesting research showing that there's patients with hippocampal lesions that you can do certain things, essentially leading them to an insight where they can use kind of what they already have in semantic memory to then kind of lead to a learning that can be remembered later. Even if they probably can't remember that they learned it with you in the lab or whatever, they can recall that particular fact, like the name of an animal or something like that. It's called fast mapping. So yeah, there's that. As far as other types of long-term memories, like, I don't know what psychedelics, like I study episodic memory, semantic memory. I think it'd be great to see like, what do they do to things like, procedural memory, motor learning, essentially. What do they do to, conditioned memories, which there is a good amount of research in animals on that. But in humans, that might be something different. So yeah, that's why I avoid. And then short-term memory, I don't like that term either, because it can mean like tomorrow or even like an hour from now, like episodic memory type stuff. It can also mean working memory, which is another thing I didn't talk about, but like being able to hold something in mind, like a telephone number or doing math in your head, which psychedelics have been shown to impair. That can also be parsed. And this is where I really want to say, if you study working memory with psychedelics, go find a working memory researcher, because that literature goes so deep that, like, even though it's a sister field to episodic memory, I don't touch working memory unless I talk to my homies. And like one of the things that like, that they've been like arguing about now is kind of like, there's this idea of working memory capacity that you can only hold 3 things in mind, plus or minus 1. The whole 7 plus or minus 2 had to get revised to 3 plus or minus 1. But then you also have a certain degree of like quality or precision for each one of those things in mind. So I can flash like a bunch of colored squares in the screen, and you're only going to remember 3 of those colors. Like the blue one is here, the red one is here, the green one is here. But now the shade of those colors can vary as well. And so something I've been wanting to say is, so working memory capacity gets massively messed up under psychedelics, like more so than with dissociatives, it seems, whereas dissociatives impair the encoding of episodic memories more so than psychedelics do. And so, but I do wonder if something like working memory precision might be, more, it might even be enhanced by something like psychedelics. So even though you can't remember all 3 of the colored squares, you got a really good shade for, exactly what shade that red was on the screen, So I think that would be a really cool area to study, but that's to kind of try to figure out what they meant by long-term memory versus short-term memory. So.
Yeah, there's so much nuance in this world of memory research. So yeah, thank you so much for unpacking that more clearly. A follow-up question from that same participant, is there any research exploring the impacts of psychedelics usage by those with amnesia or memory impairment?
No, I think it'd be really cool though. I think there's a little bit of an ethical issue there. Like if somebody doesn't have a hippocampus, like it's one thing to give them a bunch of like tasks, like giving them words and asking them if they remember them later. It's, which people do this all the time, right? And, you can even scan people's brains with amnesia. There's a lot of things, you can do as long as their caretaker, provides consent and it can pass IRBs and whatnot. But like giving somebody with giving somebody like a pretty, crazy drug manipulation, I imagine that's going to be really difficult to do. I do think it'd be interesting. And I think there was some work, I want to say in like the 60s where, people got away with things a little bit more. I think there was a study where I think they showed some type of attenuated effect of psychedelics by like a patient with hippocampal damage. This might be a false memory, by the way. But if that were true, that tells you a little bit, right? That those serotonin 2A receptors in the hippocampus, although certainly not as dense as what you find in the cortex, that those inhibitory serotonin 2A receptors might be playing a role in the psychedelic experience. And that would be really great for my flux model. But like I said, I wouldn't even be able to tell you what the authors were, what year that was, and it could just be a total memory distortion.
Yeah.
Great, thanks for that. There's a couple more. We're just gonna, let's just keep going. So like, any evidence episodic memory is improved after a psychedelic experience?
So now you're kind of talking about, I'm assuming this means kind of like post-acute, encoding now. So like, let's say the day after a psychedelic experience, the things that you're encoding that day, that following day, are you now better able to encode information? So I don't know. I mean, I think that's a great question. That's something that we are, I'm still working with the people at Hopkins. We're testing patients with alcohol use disorder and depression. We're looking at a week after psilocybin therapy, looking at episodic memory. It's kind of hard to really improve these things. Although, I mean, it certainly happens. Like patients with PTSD, for example, although it's kind of this ironic disorder where, although they have a very vivid recollection of this like negative, experience, their everyday memory is kind of poor. And so sending patients with depression, they also have bad memory. And a lot of people have shown that when you treat the depression or PTSD, that memory gets better. Or that people have even shown that like with a single dose of like an SSRI or SNRI, which doesn't improve depression, that you can get like a shift in the way they're encoding less negative things and more positive things. So that's Catherine Harmer's work at Oxford. And so there are, there could be, for example, something like that the following day, there's something else, going on. It just, or even a week later, it just hasn't quite been done. We did do this study in a population that, a Santo Daime population. So this was in collaboration again with Maastricht University. I just analyzed the data basically. And one of the most bizarre things was that when they were sober, not on ayahuasca, they had really high, these are people who've taken like ayahuasca like 500 times. The familiarity estimates from the model I was using were really high. And I mean, that paper that I keep mentioning that just got accepted from Psychological Review, that paper, I mean, I'm doing like recollection familiarity estimation across like 28 different times. And like the only times we really see familiarity estimates that high is when we gave psychedelics during memory encoding. So these people who take a lot of psychedelics might just now at this point have like walked through their everyday life with using a high sense of familiarity. And then the other thing that was interesting is when they were on ayahuasca, their recollection got better, although that might have actually been due to the beta carbolines. The ayahuasca they took ended up being really high in beta carbolines and really low in DMT. It was like 3 milligrams of DMT, which isn't really a lot if you take it orally. And so that might actually have been due to the beta carotenoids. But yeah, I don't know. As far as the following day memory enhancements, I think that's an easy question to address that. We're kind of starting to do that, but anybody could do. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So continuing on, one person asked, what's your recommended procedure or conversation when a client comes back from an ayahuasca session with a traumatic experience from childhood they have no way of confirming?
Oh, wait, I should say, by the way, people have done the study with LSD. The next day, they did find a memory enhancement. And the problem is they use a task that involves like kind of drawing, which can involve like motor memory. So you don't know exactly if it was episodic memory versus motor memory. But I forgot that was that Isabel Weissner, Weichner. I don't know. Yeah, it's a German last name, although I think she might be Brazilian, or at least she was working with a Brazilian group. But in any case, yeah, they did find that. And it's one study. It's still, it needs replication. So as far as, I mean, I don't work with clients that, well, I guess we kind of do. I guess now, in this lab that we have been, there are people who are going on, they're going on these retreats, and then we're looking at, we actually fly them in just to like get their brain scans before and after, as well as some cognitive testing. And so I don't know, none of them have actually come back as far as I know. I mean, I haven't met all of them, but none of them have come back saying they've had these recovered memories. I mean, I think that the thing that I would do in that situation is, I mean, look, yeah, it's true. I probably don't believe it. Yeah, I'm not going to tell them that because I don't think that's useful. I don't think it's, yeah, I don't want to deny anybody's, trauma. And like I said, it might actually be one of those things where it's not so much that they recovered it, but rather that they weren't ready to talk about it. And I think those are two very different things, and they might get mixed up, and so I don't want that to be the case, because I do think, I think the satanic panic was bad, but there was also situations where people started using the satanic panic as like a way of being like, oh yeah, like, no, that person's lying, they're having a false memory, and they, I never abused them. And it's like, I think even like, what is it, Prince Andrew or Andrew, the one that, was involved with Epstein. I think there was a moment where his like, trial, his lawyers or something were going to try to like use that defense. And it's like, dude, there's a photo. And so I like really want to make sure that nobody gets me wrong. Like I 100% would err on the side of believing people's trauma. It's just when people say that they recovered a repressed memory, especially from a really young point in their life where they probably might have amnesia for it and they won't ever be able to recover that memory. That's when I get a little bit like, but I'm not going to go off and, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. Yeah, that's not what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, and I just want to also presence that there does seem to be a bit of a divide in the literature where memory researchers are very skeptical that there can be recovery of these totally forgotten trauma memories, because most trauma survivors do remember at least the gist of what happened, is sort of the basis of that argument. But there are also clinicians who do have these anecdotal experiences of working with patients where they see patients have these experiences of recovering full-blown memories that they didn't previously have any details of, and do have an experience of having it corroborated from family members. So yeah, it still does seem to be like a controversial topic with different perspectives out there. So
yeah, although I will say, like, the memory researchers are pretty, I mean, it's more than just that evidence, right? Like there's a lot of evidence, and I mean, Elizabeth Loftus's work, I think, was what sort of started it. But that, yeah, we're not really buying the idea of like full-blown like recovered traumatic memories from a time when you were able to remember these things, like not talking about like when you were 2 years old or whatever. And as there's also a lot of clinicians that also don't buy it. And I think, I have a friend who, one of the things she said, I was like, yeah, have you ever seen this in your work? And she's like, no. But she was like, here's like an example of where I think that this could be sort of thought of, some people might include something like this as a recovered memory, was through therapy, not with psychedelics or anything like that, just through regular psychotherapy. One of the things that one of her patients had said was that, it was that she knew that, she was abused by her uncle. That was something that, was out there. Maybe the uncle was even put away, in prison or something. And then, but one of the things through therapy she kind of linked together was that she was able to realized that, oh, the way that this was allowed to happen was because my parents used to leave on weekends. This allowed the situation. She just hadn't connected those two ideas. She knew those two things. But it was like, and at the same time too, like putting those two ideas together in many ways, it's like, well, what does that change, right? But to that person, it was the world, right? And so like, even sometimes these things that are like innocuous connections or even false memories or whatever, they can be super useful for people. And I don't want to like deny that.
Totally.
But, you know, I do think that it can go a little bit. Yeah. I mean, I just think that the satanic panic was a great example of the capacity for memory distortion and how much that can ruin people's lives.
Nice. Amazing. Yeah, thank you for that. Let's just keep continuing on here in the sake of time. One person asked, Kabir asked, basically, he says he has lost access to his childhood memories because of trauma and a cocaine addiction. Is there any practices you would advise for helping restore them, potentially with or without psychedelics, I suppose?
I mean, I think if they're truly lost, like there's like, you know, brain damage, I unfortunately say you're probably not going to get many of them back, but I don't think that cocaine would necessarily do that. You know, cocaine's bad for many things, and it probably does, you know, do some damage to your cortex and can damage things like semantic memory or even episodic memory. But full blown, you know, like forgetting of things of the, you know, past, of like massive events or time periods, I mean, I don't know if it would necessarily do that, but yeah, I mean, I think that you could, I don't know, look at photos from when you were a kid. I think those are probably, you know, probably one way of trying to prime some of those things. I think that there's, you know, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. Yeah. I mean, I know that people with like Korsakoff syndrome, for example, they get, you know, really bad damage from alcohol, and I don't know if there's much you can do after that point. You know, once you have brain damage, it's like, I don't know, do the plasticity from psychedelics, if assuming that's actually real and important, it only, you know, can go so far. You can't reconstruct, you know, full out regions. You don't grow new neurons necessarily. And if you do, they're really only in the hippocampus, and olfactory, you know, the olfactory bulb. But yeah, so yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. Sorry.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to add to that either. I really don't know the
Yeah.
practices there. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, Melanie, do you have anything to say on that? Or
I was just going to say, maybe we should field one more question and wrap it up.
yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. Let's see. Well, these two questions we've actually covered quite in depth regarding reconsolidation. So maybe I would suggest to listen to the recording if you feel like you missed those parts of the discussion. And then last one, and I kind of know what's going to be said here, but like, what are your views on memories retrieved through hypnotic states? As in, yeah,
I mean,
I don't cover it.
I think that, yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty straightforward, that if it's something like recovery, then I don't really buy it. I think, again, but the idea of being ready to talk about something, that could, in theory, if you're in a state of hypnosis and you're, you know, more relaxed and willing to talk about things that are not easy to talk about, I think that could certainly be the case. Talk about it in a way that you otherwise wouldn't have, you know, ways that maybe normally you'd be a little ashamed of, or it just, you know, brings flashbacks or whatever. I think that's certainly doable. Yeah.
Cool. Great. Well, thanks so much for all the detailed answers, Manoj. I think there's tons of stuff that people can mine in here afterwards. And
you don't want to talk about entropy and memory retrieval, Manesh? You had that as one of your questions.
Did I? Well, the question was phrased more generally.
The reason I didn't like that question was that entropy has been shown to actually be associated with not being able to retrieve a memory. So, you know, if anything, you know, the Freudian models of, you know, psychedelic drug action in the brain should say that you shouldn't be retrieving recovered memories under the effects of psychedelics.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, it's open question on the role of entropy there. And I'd like to think of it more metaphorically, but
yeah. Well, at least with EEG entropy, that was shown. That was Tim Kern's work that showed that, failures to retrieve memories are associated with greater entropy. It's like event related. Yeah.
Right. So, I'm not committed to either position there. I'm open. So I enjoy the alternative perspectives on this, but I think it comes down to the role of hippocampal function, right? Is there a matter of top down effects from the cortex, the hippocampus being altered, or is it the hippocampus's kind of ability to contextually prime the cortex and modulate cortical functioning more important, right? That's kind of what you're saying.
There's, well, one of the things I would say with flux anyways, my flux model is, I mean, it's consistent with the work that's been out there, is that you get less just interactions between the hippocampus and cortex, that overall, I mean, that's literally what the entropic brain paper showed, was there's a decrease in functional connectivity. And then Natasha Mason, I think, has some, she hasn't published it, but she said she found that. And then if you saw that like deep sampling study by Josh Siegel, he showed that. Carly Domenico showed that in rodents. And so it's interesting that, you know, that Rebus, for example, predicted that there should be greater interactions between the hippocampus and cortex, when it was like your own data didn't show that. And that's actually what Flux would say, is there should be greater, that now the cortex is allowed to like roam free without the constraints of the hippocampus. And you know what other state is like that? REM sleep. And so, so I think that, you know, which people like to compare to psychedelics. So I don't know. Yeah, I would say that if anything, they're just kind of doing their own things more. Yeah. So
cool.
All right, y'all.
We should probably end it off here. We're half an hour over time, but thank you for those 20 people who stuck around this entire time. And the recording for this will be sent out to you and everybody else who registered for this event, and so you can watch it again at your own leisure. Lots of information packed in here. And
cool.
With that, we say thank you, and hope to see you at a future one.
Thanks, y'all.
And thank you, Manoj. Okay.
See you, everyone.